I've decided to focus on the themes of freedom in the post-Reconstruction era. We'll get to what that is in just a moment. And the Atlanta Exposition address by Booker T. Washington, which is a very famous speech that was written by Booker T. Washington, given by Booker T. Washington in 1895. And the speech actually is something that I think is quite timely because it raises a number of questions that were pertinent to African Americans shortly after their independence or their emancipation, and the Reconstruction era had ended in 1877, but questions which are still relevant today. So I have here a photograph that I found in historical archives of some young African-American women in the 1890s in Missouri. And I just wanted to use that photo because to me, this it's a very lovely photo, first of all, but it also kind of embodies, in my mind at least, the hope and the expectations that African-Americans had one generation removed from slavery. At the same time, they were also faced with a new set of tremendous challenges as the Jim Crow era became more and more part of the norm in the Southern states. And so we're going to talk about all of that today. So let me just go through a little bit of introductory information already. Maurice was kind enough to introduce who I am, but I do focus on the literatures of the African diaspora in my work. I've been a public scholar in the New Jersey Council for the Humanities Public Scholar Program since 2017. I've taught in the Adult School of Montclair Public Library since 2019. And then I also listed some of my previous courses that I have taught through the adult school, which include the literature of the Harlem Renaissance, the plays of August Wilson, the literature and legacy of Zora Neale Hurston, the magic and mystique of Carlos Fuentes' Mexico. And then I also am teaching an upcoming course called African American Memoirs, a book discussion series that will take place at the end of next month and into early August. So I can't see your faces right now, so I'm not sure if I have any returning students, but I would love to just, have some time to speak with you afterwards. And of course, we will have plenty of time to do that because this is not going to be any longer than 45 minutes. And I personally think that the questions that I get following these programs are the most stimulating aspect of the presentation. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you all have to say, questions and comments, I should say. So in terms of our agenda, I have a few texts that I want to share with you today. The first one, the most important one is Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Exposition address of 1895. But I also wanted to start off with a poem by Frances Harper, who was an early African-American writer. And her poem, Bury Me in a Free Land, is one that I chose because in my mind, it embodies the tremendous hope and excitement and sorrow of African Americans as they came out of slavery. And the poem was written actually in the antebellum era, but it's really just a cry for freedom and expresses a desire. I think what you could say is relevant to most African Americans who were enslaved, and even those who were free. That really helps us to understand why freedom was so important and what it meant to the African American community. And so I wanted to start off with that poem. We'll go through it a little bit, and then I'll give you some comments on it. And of course, if you have questions or comments, you can come back to those at the end. And then I'm going to move into some history. So I'm going to give you some historical notes on emancipation, Juneteenth, Reconstruction, and the post-Reconstruction era. And following that, then we'll get into Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Exposition address of 1895. And then the last text that I want to share with you is by W.E.B. Du Bois, who wrote a chapter on Booker T. Washington in Souls of Black Folk, which was published in 1903, and it's called On Mr. Booker T. Washington and Others. And Du Bois is one of Washington's most fervent critics. And I just want to highlight a few points from that chapter, just to understand why the Atlanta Exposition address was so important and also so controversial. So Du Bois's response to the points that are raised in Washington's Atlanta Exposition address are worth discussing in and of themselves. And then lastly, we'll have some time for questions and discussion. So that is our agenda. All right, so without further ado, this is Frances Harper's poem, Bury Me in a Free Land. And I'm just going to go ahead and read it. It was written in 1858. Make me a grave wherever you will, in a lowly plain or a lofty hill. Make it among earth's humblest graves, but not in a land where men are slaves. I could not rest if around my grave I heard the steps of a trembling slave. His shadow above my silent tomb would make it a place of fearful gloom. I could not rest if I heard the tread of a coffle gang to the shambles led, and the mother's shriek of wild despair rise like a curse on the trembling air. I could not sleep if I saw the lash drinking her blood at each fearful gash, and I saw her babes torn from her breast like trembling doves from their parents' nest. I'd shudder and start if I heard the bay of bloodhounds seizing their human prey, and I heard the captive plead in vain as they bound afresh his galling chain. If I saw young girls from their mother's arms, bartered and sold for their youthful charms, my eye would flash with a mournful flame, my death-paled cheek grow red with shame. I would sleep, dear friends, with bloated might. Can rob no man of his dearest right. My rest shall be calm in any grave where none can call his brother a slave. I ask no monument, proud and high, to arrest the gaze of the passers-by. All that my yearning spirit craves is bury me, not in a land of slaves. So I just want to give you a moment to kind of mull over that poem. And I want to share with you a little bit of information about Frances Harper. So I unfortunately have to go to the next slide here, but we can certainly come back to the poem during our questions and discussion. But Frances Harper was born in 1825. She was an African-American abolitionist, a poet, and an author. She was born free in Baltimore, so she was a free woman her entire life. And then she also became part of the abolitionist movement in Pennsylvania. And all the way up, she helped African-Americans in the Northeast all the way up through Canada. And she was part of the American Anti-Slavery Society. So she was a free Black woman who made abolition and the welfare of African-Americans enslaved in particular and free, really her life's calling. And she was also a writer. She wrote one of the first African-American novels, Iola Leroy, which was published in 1892. I'm sorry, one of the first novels written by an African-American woman, I should say. And the novel is really, in some ways, semi-autobiographical because it's about a free African-American woman who's very determined to help her people, particularly in the post-Reconstruction era. So her writing career really spans the antebellum era with poems such as Bury Me in a Land, Bury Me Not in a Land of Slaves, excuse me, all the way through the post-Reconstruction era. So she had a long career as a writer. All right, so in terms of the poem I read, Bury Me in a Free Land, I'm sorry, I just really messed up that title. There's some comments that I just want you to, think about here that I'm offering to you. And certainly I'm eager to hear what you have to say as well at the end of the presentation. But one thing that occurs to me, of course, is the protagonist is expressing her disdain of slavery by insisting that she be buried in a free land. But she also uses some very vivid examples of why she is so disdainful of slavery. She talks about the mother's shriek of wild despair, babies torn from the mother's breast, young girls bartered and sold for their youthful charms. So she's very attuned in particular to the evils of slavery and the particular horrors that they imposed upon enslaved women. And I think that's important to think about. And then the tone is also defiant. Harper wants her readers to feel the same disgust for slavery that's communicated through her protagonist, who refuses to be buried in a land of slaves. She wants to be buried in a free land. So even though we're talking about the post-Reconstruction era, I just wanted to prompt you with that poem because it's important to understand why freedom was such an urgent calling for African Americans, so to speak, in the antebellum era, and why freedom remained at the forefront of their minds throughout the Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction eras. And certainly when we see that there was a tremendous period of hope during Reconstruction after the Civil War, which then declines into this very restrictive and unfortunate era that we now know as the Jim Crow era. it's something that we should bear in mind, that this is a people that had been enslaved for 243 years, and becoming free meant so much to them. And so when we think about that in light of Juneteenth and in light of what happened in the late 19th century, we should remember texts such as Bury Me in a Free Land, because it helps us to understand why freedom meant so much to African Americans. And in the case of Frances Harper, she was already free, and yet she could not stand the sight of seeing her people enslaved. Okay, so again, I'm using this text to kind of help us to think about freedom on this very momentous occasion known as Juneteenth, what freedom is and why it's so important. I'm going to move on now and give you some historical information about Juneteenth and the Emancipation Proclamation and Reconstruction in the post-Reconstruction era. So some of this might be already, pretty well known by some of you, which is fine. It might just be review. For others of you might not be as familiar with this history, but I think, again, it's important to understand this history as we build into our discussion of Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Exposition address. All right, so Juneteenth is a holiday which is commemorated because of events that took place on June 19th, 1865 in Galveston, Texas. It is considered the preeminent holiday in the United States, which commemorates the legacies of slavery and emancipation of African Americans. And the reason why Juneteenth exists is because the Emancipation Proclamation was issued on January 1st, 1863. However, enslaved African Americans in Galveston, Texas, did not find out that they were free until June 19th, 1865, 2.5 years later. It wasn't an accidental omission. The news was suppressed in Texas, in Galveston and other parts of Texas, because of course, the slaveholding class had no interest in letting people know that they were free. And also, of course, there was a war going on. So this was seen as information that they kept away from them as long as possible. It wasn't until actually after the Civil War ended, the Confederacy had surrendered 2 months prior, that General Gordon Granger rode into Galveston and read the Emancipation Proclamation. And then people finally realized, oh my goodness, we're free. And we've been free for 2.5 years already. It was a huge shock, to say the least. It should be said that slavery did not end on June 19, 1865, because the Emancipation Proclamation did not address the issue of slavery in the border states, which were Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Virginia. Slavery was finally stamped out in the border states in December of 1865. So if you follow the news, you might be aware that there's a little bit of controversy right now with Juneteenth being celebrated as an Emancipation Day for African Americans, because historians and others are aware that actually slavery kind of went on another 6 months in some parts. It wasn't until December of 1865, I believe, that the final African Americans who had been enslaved in the border states were finally, freed. And so just to be aware of that. That said, there are still a lot of people who think it's wonderful that we are finally acknowledging a holiday which celebrates the emancipation of African Americans, because this is long overdue. So, there's different perspectives on Juneteenth and its designation as a federal holiday, but just to kind of be aware of the nuances there with the history. All right, so I have this historical cartoon from Harper's Magazine in 1866 that I wanted to share, and it's labeled the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was one of the first Reconstruction departments that was established by the federal government, and it was meant to ensure that newly freed African Americans would have what they needed as they tried to reestablish themselves as freed persons in terms of their political and economic and educational needs. And so this cartoon in Harper's shows this gentleman in the middle who's supposed to be a representative of the Freedmen's Bureau, and he's basically trying to broker some kind of peace between, on the left-hand side, what looked to be like some angry white Southern individuals. And then on the right-hand side, you have some newly emancipated African Americans. So the cartoon is meant to show them, as I guess, at each other's throats, so to speak. And the Freedmen's Bureau is there to kind of bring peace and so on and so forth. This, of course, is a cartoon. It's an interpretation of what the Freedmen's Bureau was doing. There was a lot of support for the Freedmen's Bureau. There was a lot of detractors as well. But I think it's important to kind of be aware of what happened during Reconstruction from a historical perspective, just to know why it's so important, and also why the post-Reconstruction era is so so difficult and so much of a letdown for African Americans following this era of Reconstruction. So Reconstruction is considered to be the 12-year period between 1865 and 1877, when the country was literally rebuilding itself following the Civil War. During this period, the United States began the process of reconstructing itself. Newly freed African Americans were central to this process, and there was this question on everyone's minds, which was, how would they fit into the nation now that they were free? So what are you supposed to do with this population of people who had been enslaved for 243 years, and now they're told, okay, they're going to be part of the country again. So what does that mean? The federal government assisted by establishing the Freedmen's Bureau, as I just mentioned. The Freedmen's Bureau was focused on the immediate needs and long-term goals of the African American population. And during Reconstruction, there were many gains that were made, including African Americans who were elected to office. So this, of course, is one of those facts that people oftentimes are unaware of, but there were African American elected officials to Congress during Reconstruction. Just a few years after emancipation, you had elected members of Congress who were African American from the southern states. So there was really a tremendous effort to get African Americans fully integrated very quickly into the society. Now, with that effort came tremendous resentment from Southern whites in particular, who felt that, of course, not only had they lost a war, but the people who they had once enslaved were literally challenging them for office. And so when Reconstruction ended in 1877, the federal troops were withdrawn from the South. This quickly gave rise to a backlash against Reconstruction and the onset of Jim Crow laws and regulations, which were intended to strip African Americans of their mobility and curtail their ability to exercise their civil rights. And so the Jim Crow era went into effect pretty quickly. Just about all the southern states after 1877 started enacting laws constricting the movements of African Americans. Of course, the separate but equal philosophy arose to try to justify some of these restrictions. And so essentially what happened is that tremendous progress that happened in 12 years was not only deleted, but African Americans found themselves to be in a very difficult and volatile situation, in some cases a life-threatening situation. In the case of the rise of militias such as the Ku Klux Klan and other terror organizations that were basically intended to ensure that the African American population was restricted in terms of their movements and in terms of their ability to gain any political or economic control within the southern states. And so this becomes a very, terrifying period in many ways. As we know, we don't have time to get into the whole history of the post-Reconstruction. But the reason why I think it's important to actually start with this history before we get into the Atlanta Exposition address is because it's important to understand the context in which Booker T. Washington is giving this speech in 1895. So this is now almost 20 years following the end of Reconstruction, and things are pretty dismal for African Americans. Jim Crow is in full effect. Their lynchings have already started, and this becomes a facet of 20th century Southern life for African Americans up until the 1940s, the rise of lynchings, extrajudicial murders. There is very, very little mobility in terms of political representation. All of the elected officials who had been elected during Reconstruction have lost their offices. It's just, it's something that for us in the 21st century, we really have to put our minds back in time, so to speak, and think about what it means to be free, and then to have this tremendous excitement about where your people are heading, and then to have all that taken away from you. And of course, the post-Reconstruction era, or I should say the Jim Crow era, lasted all the way up until the 1960s. And so there's a lot going on in 1895. There's a lot of frustration, and there are a lot of people who are, starting to question what is the best direction for African Americans in light of these tremendous pressures that they're dealing with in the South, and also increasingly in the North, when African Americans migrate north. Of course, that becomes more of an issue in the 20th century, but there's pressures there as well, which we don't have time to get into today. But so I just want you guys to think about that as we talk about the Atlanta Exposition address and how that speech intends to provide some answers during this very turbulent era. Whether they're answers we agree with or not is something we can certainly have time to discuss at the end. So last note on Reconstruction here, when I was in college, Eric Foner, who's a historian at Columbia University, where I did my bachelor's, he was already pretty popular then, but his book, Reconstruction, America's Unfinished Revolution, is one that really changed the discussion around Reconstruction. And it's considered a landmark text in the history of Reconstruction. And so I just wanted to kind of give you that title if you're interested in reading more about Reconstruction. But I love the subtitle, America's Unfinished Revolution, indeed unfinished, because if Reconstruction had been successful, we probably would not be dealing with a lot of the issues that we're dealing with in the 21st century in terms of race relations. But it was not successful, or I should say it was unfinished. It was successful, and then it was brought to an abrupt end. But anyway, that's a conversation for another time. And then Henry Louis Gates Jr.'s book, Stony the Road, Reconstruction, White Supremacy, and the Rise of Jim Crow is another excellent text to think about or to read if you're interested in learning more about Reconstruction and the aftermath of Reconstruction. So let's get into our discussion now of Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Exposition address. So I want to prompt you with the most famous line from that speech, which is cast down your bucket where you are. This is a line that has entered, the public lexicon in terms of how we think about the best way to deal with various situations in life. Booker T. Washington's advice to African Americans: cast down your bucket where you are. I should say not to African Americans, because we'll get into this. There were actually at least two audiences for the speech, but his message of cast down your bucket where you are. What does that mean, to cast down your bucket where you are? And why is that a message that Washington wanted to share at this very turbulent time in 1895? So just a little bit about Booker T. Washington, one of the most celebrated leaders within African-American history, education, politics. He was an educator. He was someone who was born enslaved, okay, in 1856. He was a slave until he was 8 years old, or 7 years old, excuse me. And he rose to become not only educated, but also one of the most distinguished members of the African-American community in the late 1800s. An advisor who was someone who was looked upon with great respect by both Black and white leaders during his time period. So we should always bear in mind that Washington was someone who was held in extremely high regard. Despite the fact that not everyone agreed with what he said, he was one of the most esteemed members of the African-American community, all the way up to the end of his life, really. And so he was primarily known for his work in founding Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, which became his home base. He was the president of Tuskegee for many, many years, but he also had an entire philosophy which he expounded upon regularly on how African Americans could move forward in the post-Reconstruction era. What was the best way for African Americans to move, how they could utilize the resources to their collective advantage, and really just the future of race relations in the United States. So he had ideas for all these topics, and he shared them very frequently. And so the Atlanta Exposition address, which we're going to talk about in just a moment, really expresses some of his key points in that address, at least the key points of his philosophy. And it's one which is certainly worth thinking about in depth, because it is a philosophy that continues to have a tremendous amount of influence in this society. It resonates quite a bit with other philosophies of the American experience, if you will. And it's also one which has had tremendous currency within the African-American community in particular. So I'm just going to go ahead and read. I know you all have already read the text, but I want to just go ahead and read this passage from the Atlanta Exposition address. A ship lost at sea for many days suddenly sighted a friendly vessel. From the mast of the unfortunate vessel was seen a signal: "Water, water, we die of thirst." The answer from the friendly vessel at once came back: "Cast down your bucket where you are." So when I teach this text to my undergraduates, I always have them mull over this, this anecdote, right? What does that mean to cast down your bucket where you are, right? And oftentimes students will say, well, if you're in the middle of the sea, you can't drink the salty water. So what is he talking about? Cast down your bucket where you are, okay? And yes, that's true. You cannot drink salty water. You can drink it, but it's not a great idea. So what is Washington talking about here? Why is he advising people to do something which seems impossible? Well, the answer to that is it may seem impossible, but it's not entirely impossible if you are creative and if you are resourceful. So what Washington is trying to encourage people to do here is to look at a situation that looks difficult, that looks impossible, and find a solution anyway. Think about the resources that you have. Think about the resources in your community. Think about the resources in that sea, which seems undrinkable, and still find a way to nourish yourself, basically. And so it's a very apt metaphor in a lot of ways, one which, again, can really inspire people to think creatively, to focus on their talents and skills and abilities, which they might not be inspired to use, to think about how they can make the most of any situation, no matter how dire it might seem. And so this was Washington's message in 1895: cast down your bucket where you are. Okay. Now, specifically, who and what was he talking about? So again, the message here, we'll focus on the what, and then we'll get into the specifics in just a moment here. Be resourceful, use what is available at your disposal to improve your situation. Focus on concrete, tangible economic goals as markers of progress. Don't get too caught up with the philosophical, with the theoretical, with the impractical. Washington was someone who believed that it was 100 times better to focus on what you can do in the here and now and what actually will yield results in the here and now. So that's really the hallmark of his philosophy. It should be noted that Tuskegee was largely an industrial institute, so it taught trades to young African-American men and women so that they could become skilled laborers. And of course, nowadays it's a 4-year university with liberal arts programs and so on and so forth. But Washington's philosophy in the 1890s, and Tuskegee was founded prior to that, but his philosophy was that African Americans should use the skills that they already have and should build upon those skills with other concrete, tangible, practical skills. That's what can help them to move forward. Now, just be mindful here, this speech was not only intended towards African Americans. There were at least 2 audiences, and I always, again, remind my students of that. So Washington was also addressing white Southerners in the speech. Cast down your buckets where you are means let bygones be bygones. Yes, you are now living side to side with people who used to work for you for free, but now they need a job and you need people to help you do your job. So let's try to put the past where it belongs in the past and move forward and help each other, not necessarily because we want to be best friends, but because we have a mutual economic incentive to help one another, basically. So he believed that white Southerners should work with Blacks to rebuild America. He tells whites explicitly in the speech, as you all probably remember, to hire Blacks in the occupations that they are already familiar with. Give them jobs and things that they already know how to do. And you'll make money. They'll be happy because they're earning a living and everyone can move ahead. So that was really what he was trying to do. He was trying to build a sense of cooperation, if not cohesion, at least cooperation along economic lines. And of course, his other audience was the first generation of African Americans, of freed African Americans in the South. He wanted them to cast down their buckets by using skills in fields that they are already familiar with, Again, the emphasis is on vocational education, and it is a practical strategy for advancement. So once again, think about what you can already do. Think about what you are willing to learn how to do, which you can do where you are, and use those practical skills to get ahead, to build a base for your family and your community, which will help you to get ahead and will help others to get ahead as well. So in essence, that is, those are the hallmarks of Washington's address. Once again, cast down your bucket means to be resourceful, be industrial, be practical. And he believed everyone should cast down their buckets. So oftentimes he focused on his message for African Americans without realizing that there's also a message for white Southerners as well. They too need to cast down their buckets and focus on the people in their midst who oftentimes are skilled laborers, who are in search of employment, which was a huge issue, of course, in the 1890s for African Americans. Yes, they're free, but they need jobs, they need to survive, they need to make a living. So why don't we work together? Because we have a mutual economic incentive to do so. All right. So again, I'm sure that there's plenty of comments and thoughts about this, this approach. We can come back to those at the end of the presentation. I have about 8 more minutes left, and then we can get into our discussion. So I want to sort of segue here into Du Bois. We're skipping ahead a little bit because I want to talk about the criticisms that Washington endured. And his most fervent critic was W.E.B. Du Bois. And Du Bois wrote famously in 1903, The Souls of Black Folk, that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Souls of Black Folk is Du Bois's preeminent text, published in 1903, and remains really one of the most interesting scholarly and personal texts by an African-American academic. So Du Bois is writing from a very philosophical perspective, but he's also writing about his own personal experiences as an African-American as well in that text, The Souls of Black Folk. So Du Bois, as I've mentioned already, and you probably would pick up on this already if you have any understanding of Du Bois's program and his philosophy and his focus on civil rights. Du Bois was not a fan of Booker T. Washington's approach to African Americans. He had very, very, very different viewpoints on many of these subjects. And so when he criticizes the Atlanta Exposition address, it's important to understand that this is coming from the perspective of a person who, at this point in his life, is prepared to spend many, many, many years working on the cause of civil rights and political gains for African Americans. And he ends up becoming, as many people have called him, really the grandfather of the civil rights movement. And so someone who identifies as being, or even if he didn't quite identify, but someone who understands his life's work as being focused on civil rights and the political emancipation of African Americans is a person who is not going to take too kindly to the idea that they should not be focused on those issues. They should just be focused on practical issues of how to find a job, how to provide for your family. All that's important, but Du Bois said it's not enough. It is not enough. And he did not like what he saw as Washington detracting from what he saw as the heart of the issue, which was the political status of African Americans. I heard somebody over the chat, and again, I see we have a comment from Jennifer. Yes, I'm glad that you found that metaphor interesting, Jennifer. Cast on your buckets by Booker T. Washington. We can come back to that in just a moment after we finish the discussion of Du Bois. We can come back to anything else you want to say about Washington's Atlanta Exposition address, and specifically Cast on your buckets. Well, let's get into some of the criticisms that Du Bois levied towards Booker T. Washington. Okay, so he wrote an entire essay on Washington called On Mr. Booker T. Washington and Others, and it's a chapter in The Souls of Black Folk. And he has a few points, and he lays them out in a very, very clear fashion. So the first one is that Du Bois sees Washington's platform as incongruous with needs and desires of African Americans following slavery. Okay. Now, of course, that point is open for debate. Other people might say, no, Washington is exactly on track. Of course, coming out of slavery, you need to find a job as a skilled laborer. Like, how else are you going to eat, right? So, there's definitely different ways of looking at this issue. But Du Bois, in his opinion, saw this platform as incongruous with what he understood as the needs and desires of African Americans following slavery. And I think desires is probably the most important thing in this particular criticism here. Possibly, Washington's platform met some of the economic needs of African Americans, but did it fulfill their desires? For people for whom freedom meant so much, telling them to put their heads down, essentially, and not worry about political issues as the Jim Crow era encroached, may not have fulfilled their desires. And I think that certainly that is a criticism that is worth at least thinking about. Secondly, Du Bois saw Washington as catering to the wants of various groups of whites over the needs of Blacks. Okay, so this was a criticism that Washington endured from a lot of individuals, that he was essentially pandering to whites by saying, listen, you have nothing to fear from African Americans, just give them a job, they'll be happy, they'll leave you alone, they won't try to vote. And he saw this as being, really disdainful, because he felt that Washington should be centering the needs of African Americans, including the political needs of African Americans, first and foremost. And so, again, open for debate. Washington could easily rebut that argument by saying, no, I'm not pandering, I'm not catering, but I'm focusing on the most important thing, which is making sure people have jobs, making sure people are employed, making sure that there is some economic stability. And I think to some extent, Washington did argue those points for himself. So again, there's certainly room to debate for all these issues. The third point is that Du Bois saw Washington as ignoring the major problem for African Americans post-Reconstruction, which was their loss of political rights and representation. And again, this is a very sad era, because for a 12-year period, it seemed like African Americans were on the up and up in a very quick and optimistic way, because there were members of Congress, there were people who were thrilled to become educated so that they could hopefully study the law and become lawyers. And, again, you might say, oh, that's a bit of a stretch for people coming out of slavery, but that's how much excitement people had about becoming free and about moving ahead. Certainly not everybody, but some people. And then after Reconstruction ended, all of those possibilities disappeared, and it happened very quickly again. And so it was a huge blow. And Du Bois thought Washington kind of swept some of this under the rug. Let's deal with the devastation that people are experiencing after losing their political rights, right? Rights that they've only enjoyed for a little over a decade, and now they don't have them anymore. Not because 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are still on the books, but because the Southern states have essentially curtailed the expression of those amendments through local laws and state laws. All right. And then the last point is that he felt that on a practical level, Washington's platform simply could not work. And then he has 3 points to illustrate why he believed it couldn't work. The first is that African Americans could not move forward economically if they can't defend their status through exercising the right to vote. So he believed that, well, even if you agree with this platform, it's hard to move forward unless you can vote. You need to be able to protect your status in the country through political rights. Economically, yes, you can always get a job, but you can't build economically unless you have some kind of political security. And so that was the first point that he made. Again, open to debate, but that was, again, a valid criticism in some ways, because yes, political rights, or I should say economic rights, don't exist in a vacuum. Political rights are certainly tied into that picture as well. The second point is that if African Americans are going to have self-respect, then they need to stand up for themselves. So he was just concerned with the psychological welfare of African Americans and what it would mean for them to basically just go along with Washington's platform and not fight for their political rights, even though they deserve those rights, even though those rights had already been granted at the federal level. He was concerned about what that would mean to them psychologically. And to be fair, Du Bois is quite concerned with the psychology of African Americans. It comes across in the Souls of Black book, where he spends a lot of time talking about double consciousness, which is still one of the most insightful ways of understanding the psychosocial dynamics of what it means to be Black in a society where Blackness is disdained, and how African Americans simultaneously struggle to fit in and also to preserve their sense of self. So Du Bois, legitimately was interested in and worried about the psychological state of mind of African Americans. So that's where that second point is coming from. And then lastly, he believed that if people are to maintain even ordinary working class jobs, they still need to be trained by a class of highly educated individuals. And he believed that Washington didn't focus on this by focusing on industrial education alone. So in other words, who are going to be the professors at places like Tuskegee and in Howard University and so forth? You need a class of people who can educate the people who, are going to be working these jobs. They still need some education. And so you still need to invest in helping people to get to that higher level. And again, another tenet of Du Bois's philosophy was what he called the talented 10th. Basically, he wanted to invest in an African-American leadership class, which he, somewhat arbitrarily decided should be about 10% of the population. These would be people who would become political representatives of the African-American community, would be highly educated, would be able to really provide leadership in political and philosophical and educational and social issues. And so he believed that essentially Washington was ignoring the need for an educated segment of the African-American population. Again, it's up for debate because certainly Washington himself was such a member. He pretty much embodied the definition of the talented 10th. And so I don't think you could say that he was against it for that reason alone. But at the same time, he did believe that industrial education should be the focus for most African Americans in this particular point in time. And it should be said that Washington also believed that over time, things would probably get better. Again, this is all speculation because his program was never fully enacted upon. But he believed that over time, for the course of a couple of generations, then maybe there would be more room for African Americans to focus on political rights and higher education and so on and so forth. So he wasn't ignoring these things altogether, but he didn't think that the 1890s was the right time to focus on all these issues. So my last point, and then we'll get into our discussion, just has to do with, the questions for discussion, but I just want you all to think about just the relevance of some of these points to where we are today. So how do we reconcile Booker T. Washington's ideals with those of detractors such as W.E.B. Du Bois? Both of these individuals have made tremendous contributions to African-American life. They're both, worthy of veneration, and yet they had very different viewpoints. So how can we reconcile these viewpoints? Is there a way to reconcile them? Maybe there isn't. I always ask this question when I teach this text because I think it's important to think about whether there is a middle ground or whether we have to be polarized around these issues of economic productivity and political gain. And sort of as a follow-up question to that, I want you to think about why this debate over political ascension and economic advancement is still so relevant to African Americans. And then to tie it back in with Juneteenth, what does this relevance mean in light of the historic quest for freedom symbolized by Juneteenth? So those are questions I want to leave you all with, and I'm hoping that you all have some other questions and comments for discussion, but I'm going to go ahead and exit the screen share in just a moment. I can always come back if you want to look at another slide, but I would love to kind of see your faces and get into our discussion. So let me go ahead and do that. Go to my gallery view. All right. So